Hello everyone. This video is a follow-up to an earlier one where I talked about painting terrains in Blender. In that video, I only showed how to blend diffuse maps together, and since then a lot of you have sent me questions about how to include other shader features such as normal maps or displacement. In this video, I'm going to go through a more in-depth process that lets you blend more complex shaders together using masks, and can even handle displacement. The workflow is also a little cleaner than the first video, so you can use that to stop your shader node network from looking too crazy. Alright, let's get started. First of all, we're going to want to make sure that we have some important add-ons enabled that we're going to be using in this workflow. Come up here to Edit and Preferences, and make sure that you have Node Wrangler installed. Just type in Node. Make sure the little checkbox next to Node Wrangler is on, and we're also going to want the landscape. And make sure the checkbox here next to Ant Landscape is also checked. Alright, let's create our first geometry. Let's get rid of the default cube and let's replace that with a grid. And we're going to want to make sure there is enough geometry on this grid to be able to show the roughness of our terrain. So let us, I missed my chance. Let's delete that, Shift A, grid. Click on there and make sure this is 128 by 128. And now we will have all the vertices that we need. That should be plenty. Let's move this to the side. And now let's also create a landscape. Shift A, down here to landscape. And this will create a procedural landscape for you. That's the default. If you want to go with a different one, you can get some cliffs, or you can get some get a mesa. There's lots of different varieties. We're just going to go with the default. And that is the geometry we're going to use. Of course, if you have your own hand-sculpted landscape, you can use that instead. Whatever mesh you want, as long as it has enough geometry to be able to show the bumps, is what you need. One more thing we need to do is make sure that we have the UV set up on our terrain, because by default you don't get any. Just come over here to the UV editing tab and press 7 to go into overhead mode. Let's zoom in a little bit. Now we're going to press U to unwrap and select Project from View Bounds. What this is going to do is project straight down along the Z-axis and create a nice flat and even version of those UVs, and that's exactly what we want for this sort of mesh. And let's just come back here into Layout tab, and now we have our UVs set up. Now let's create our material for our terrain. To start with, we're just going to go with one layer. So just one type of terrain for now. We'll get to adding in extras later on. But we're going to begin by dragging up our timeline editor here and switching that over to a shader editor. And we're going to want to put a material on our terrain there. So let's click New. And you can see by default, we get a principled BDSF shader. This is what this is sort of the generic all-purpose shader that Blender gives you by default, and that's exactly what we want. And we're going to press Control-Shift-T because we have Node Wrangler enabled, and that will bring up this browser that will allow us to select several materials at once and set them up all at once. So these are a bunch of textures I downloaded from Polyhaven. That's this website here. So if you want to get these same textures, you can download them from this website. And we can select the forced ground 0, 1 here and hold down Shift and to select 4 in a row and principal texture setup. And that will automatically, let's make this a little bit bigger. That will automatically get 4 of these all set up and plugged into our material. You can see we have the color, we have the roughness, we have the normal map, and we have the displacement map here. Let's just bring that down so it's a little easier to see. These guys are overlapping a little bit too much there. And you can see that we have the principled BDSF is now going into the surface of our material, and the displacement is being calculated from the displacement map, and that is going into the displacement parameter of our material output here. And if we just look in the viewport, and if we switch over to rendered mode, you can now see that material applied to the surface of our model. And let's actually click on that guy. Let's make sure he has the same material so we can see the flat version. And let's rename that to landscape. Okay, now you might notice that this is not terribly bumpy at the moment. What's happening with our displacement map? Well, we need to enable that because in Blender, first of all, displacement maps only work when you're in cycles. So let's come over to the scene settings and change this from EV to cycles. And we're also going to need to modify the material. So if we click on the terrain and come down here to the material editor, scroll all the way to the bottom and under settings, and this, you won't see this particular setting in EV. This only shows up if you're in cycles. Come down here to surface displacement, and under bump only, let's change that to displacement and bump. And now you can see that displacement is really having some fun with our meshes here. That's because it is turned up a little bit way too high. So if we come down here to the displacement node, we can turn this down a little bit. Let's actually look at our plane over here. Turn that scale down to something like that. Okay, 0 is a little bit too much. 0.1 is about right. And let's press 3 to go into side view. We want to make sure that the midpoint is lined up right along the XZ or XY plane there. If it isn't, you can play with the mid-level to push it down or push it up a little bit. I think actually 0.5. Actually, I do think that 0.4 is a little bit better than the default. So let's leave that there. And now you have a material that has displacement on it. Now, this is fine if you just want to have this one grass shader for your entire mesh, but what if you want to add some rocks in some places, or maybe put some mud down here in the valley area? Well, you can do that by adding a mask to your shader. So let's go up, and first of all, you can see that we have a pretty complicated shader here right now with a lot of moving parts. Let's clean this up a little bit by drawing a box around that, pressing Ctrl-G to make it a group. Now, if you look at this little set of labels up here, this sort of describes the structure. You can see right now we're inside the node group that we just created. If I press Control-Tab, we just hop back up a layer. Notice that that node group we just created is missing now. And that's because that is all of that complicated stuff is now in this one node here. I can expand that node by just clicking on it and pressing Tab key, and we hop back into it. Notice that reappeared there, and Control-Tab, we go back one layer up. You can think of this sort of as a nesting doll, where if you click on one of these dark green nodes and you press the Tab key, you go into it, and you can see all the guts that make it up. And we're also going to put a label on this. We're going to call this grass, just so that it's, actually let's call that grass shader, just so it's easier to keep track of what's going on. So we now know this node that we just created is the grass shader, and if we click on it and press Tab, we can see everything that is inside our grass shader. So let's Control-Tab to get back up to the top level again. Okay, that was your quick introduction to how groups work. Now, let's say that we want to add a second shader onto this. Let's add a mud shader. We're going to press Shift-A and create a new shader. So here under the shader thing, and principled BDSF, just like what we had before. And let's put it down over there. And just like what we did before, we're going to press Control-Shift-T. And we are going to grab a different set of textures this time. Let's go with the cracked mud. It is that texture, and we have the displacement, we have the normal, and we have the roughness. Let's select all of those, and there is our next node network. Let's just move this a bit to the side. Whoops, I deselected everything there. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we want to mix these two together. So I can press Shift A, and now we're going to go for shader and mix shader. And what this is going to do is it's going to mix together that shader there and this shader here. And we're going to be sending that to the output. Now, by changing the factor here, we can edit how much we get from the one or from the other. If we set that down to 0, you can see we're getting 100% of the mud. And if we set that up to 1, you can see we're getting 100% of the grass. And I'm just going to simplify this over here a little bit too. Let's grab all of this, press Ctrl G to turn that into another node. Let's press Ctrl Tab to get out. Let's label that mud shader. Okay. And now what we're going to want to do is create a mask that lets us sometimes use the mud shader and use the grass shader in other places. And you might notice we don't have displacement hooked up for the mud shader yet. Don't worry, we'll get to that shortly. But for now, let's get the mask. And the mask is just press Shift A, image, texture, image texture. And we're going to be using the color output of this into the factor node. But first, let's create a new image. Let's click on this and click New. Let's call this Mud Mask. And choose the width and height that you want. The default should be fine, and everything else here should be fine too. And because we're using this as numeric data, we don't want this to be sRGB. We're going to set this to non-color so that Blender doesn't provide any weird pre-processing on it. And now we're going to plug the color into the factor here. And you can see right away it switched everything to mud because wherever this is black, we're going to be drawing whatever's on top, and wherever it's white, we're going to be drawing whatever's on the bottom. And by default, it's all black. In fact, let's change that around. By default, it should probably be the grass shader. So let's put the mud on the bottom and the grass on the top. Okay, and now let's paint. If we come over here to texture paint, let's switch over to this mode here. This is the one that is done in Eevee. And when you're painting, you need to be in Eevee because you don't get real-time feedback when you're painting in cycles. Make sure that mud mask is selected here. Sometimes you might get something else and then you're going to be painting into the wrong layer. But, and let's see, our paint is white and we're using the paintbrush. So now if we paint on the surface there, oh, wait, let's make sure that's selected first. Object mode, select that. Object mode, go back into texture paint. And now if we paint on the surface, wherever we painted in white, we are going to get that mud coming through. And I think we can do that over here with the train. We can also sort of paint on the train, and this way you can sort of make sure the bit of the train that you want to be mud becomes mud. And now let's save our mask to make sure that we don't accidentally lose it. Save as, we will call that, let's call this terrain mask 2. You can see that I've already done some experimenting with this. Okay, and if we hop back over here into layout mode, you can see the results of adding in that mask. Now, let's have another look at those shader nodes. You can see right now there's not a whole lot to them. They just have the shader extension coming straight out of them. Let's change that. Let's tab to go inside. And now what we want to do is we want to expose some of these parameters. So what we're going to do is, you see you have the group input over here, and right now there's nothing coming out of it. Well, we're going to change that. We're going to drag the location, the rotation, and the scale over to the inputs. So now that, instead of having to come into the node to adjust those things, they're now exposed on the outside, so we can adjust them there. Similarly, we are also going to want to expose the displacement parameters. So let's drag the mid-level over here, and the same with the scale. And now if we Control-Tab to go back out, you can see we have all those parameters on the outside. So if we wanted to, let's say, change the rotation, we could put a 45 in there, and that is going to rotate the texture. Or is it y-axis? Well, you can also do it with the scale too. So if we wanted to scale that up to 10, you can see that our mud shader is now much more dense than it was before. So let's undo that. And one more thing, let's go back into the mud shader node and put our group input back over here. We also want to be able to use a displacement, because right now you can see we're calculating the displacement in this node, but we're not doing anything with it. Well, we're going to drag that over here to the outputs. So now if we go back out, you can see we now have a displacement output on the mud shader. And we're going to do something similar down here with the grass shader so that we can edit these parameters on the inside. Let's drag the location, rotation, and scale over here. And let's also get those displacement parameters, the mid-level, and the scale. All right, and those are now all inputs too. And you can see we already have the displacement going to the group output, so we don't need to do anything extra over here. Now we're going to want to blend together the displacements from these two nodes here. Let's give yourself a little bit more room. See, right now we're using the factor to linearly interpolate between our mud shader and our grass shader. We want to do that with the displacements as well. Fortunately, Blender does not come with a linearly interpolate operator, so we're going to have to make one ourselves. So to start with, we'll press Shift-A and come down here to Converter and then down to Vector Math. We are going to start with just an ordinary add node, not because this is going to be our final, but because we need something to make the group with. Okay, and just like our mix shader, we are going to have the mud come in on the bottom because that's going to be with the white, and we're going to have the grass come in on the top because that is going to be the black. Now we're going to click the add node and press Control-G to turn that into a group. All right, now to make some math out of this. So next, let's add a scale node because we are going to want to scale these vectors. That is also going to be a vector math. Change this to scale, which is that one at the bottom. And so this is going to be the factor coming in. And let's actually move that up to the top so it looks like the mix node. There we go. Let's call that factor. And put that up top. All right. And now what we're going to want to do is have the actually no, we're going to want the bottom node scaled by the factor because the factor is going to multiply by the bottom. And for the top, we are going to want to add a math node. Let's just type in math. And this is going to be 1 minus the factor. And that is going to go into the scale, and this is going to be for the bottom. Let's move that over. All right, this is going to be for the top, I mean. All right, so and then we're going to add these two together. Here's the top plus the bottom. And this is the this is a linear interpolation equation. It's just 1 minus the factor times the top one plus the factor times the bottom one added together. Let's tab out of that and let's rename that to lerp, just so we can properly label everything. And now, instead of having just the displacement of the grass, we are now having the displacement of both of them as determined by the map, or at least we also want to bring the color down here. And now you can see that the mud has the height map of, or the displacement of the mud, and the grass has the displacement of the grass. Although we're going to have to tweak that mud. You can see that the scale is 1. That's a little bit too high. Let's bring that down to 0.1. And that is looking a lot more reasonable. And in fact, if we go to the side, yeah, that looks reasonable for the mid-level too. And if you can see on the terrain over here, we are also getting that nice depth or displacement texture on our model. Just one more thing to clean up. Let's go back into our editor here. And now, instead of having a mix shader and a lerp node right next to each other, let's put those into a group too. This is going to be our new combined shader, and you can see that we have the, let's spread these out a little bit. We have the shader going into the mix shader, and we have the displacement going into the lerp. In fact, let's rename that to displacement just to keep our labels clear. And same for that guy. And we're going to do the same for the output. All right, and now if we tab back out, we can rename that node to mix shader displacement, just so we can keep track of what's going on here. And now we've created this great little node here that lets you input the the BDSF and the displacement of two different shader nodes, and use a mask to interpolate between them. Now, what if you want to add a third layer? Well, now that we have all this work done, it's actually a lot easier to add more layers to it. Let's just create a copy of our mix shader node there, or our custom mix shader node, and let's create a second mask. And we're also going to want to have our third material. So it's going to press Shift-A, down to shader, and let's make that principled BSDF. And just like before, Control-Shift-T in Node Wrangler to bring up all the pieces we want. This time, let's make a rocky shader. So let's get a rocky trail. Actually, no, that's not the one I wanted. This one, rocks ground 1. Okay, select those four, principled texture setup, and there is our monster of a shader network there. Let's just bring that up there. Okay, now in order to actually make this a group, we have to actually connect this to something. So let's just start by, let's connect you into there, just to start with. Now it's possible to turn this into a group, so select all that, press Ctrl-G. here we are inside the group. So just like before, we are going to move the location, the rotation, and the scale over to the group input. And we are also going to bring the mid-level and scale over here. Let's put the inputs back over there, and for the outputs, connect the displacement output to the group output, and that should be all you need. Let's Control Tab back out of there. And now we're going to want to combine this with the other shaders, so let's bring everything down here. So the this shader is going to be the under because we want this layer to go on top. So this guy is actually going to go to the top. And this guy is going to go into the bottom slots. And then we're going to connect this to the output. And you can see right now it's just sort of blending between the two. If we set the factor, well, the factor is at 1, so what we're getting is 100% of our this shader. Let's call that Rocky. And let's press 3 to go into side view. And let's turn this down to something reasonable. That looks lumpy enough. Do we want? Yeah, I think 0.2 works, and mid-level looks fine. Okay, so let's use that as is, and now we just need the mask. So we duplicated this mask texture over here. Let's delete the texture we have there already and create a new one. Let's call this Rocky Mask. And the width and height are fine. Click OK. Make sure that this is non-color. And now we can plug that into the factor. So by default it's all black, but if we come over here into texture paint mode, and wait for my computer to catch up here a bit. There we go. Make sure Rocky Mask is selected right here, and now we can just paint on the surface. So if we put a white streak right there, you can see that that white is now covering up what was underneath it. So if we want that section to be rocky there, and maybe put some rocks over here. Okay, and because this particular mode uses EV, you're not going to see the displacement. But if we come back over here into layout view and we are using cycles again, just wait for my computer to catch up. You will see that we now have that displacement map working on our rocks as well. And you can just repeat that process as many times as you want. Just add in a new mix shader displacement node, add in a new node for the shader you want to add, and add in a new node for your mask. And that's all for this video. I hope you found this useful. Please like and subscribe, it helps out the channel. And until next time, thanks for watching.